For the first time in over 25 years, we're creating a new universe with Starfield. Set hundreds of years in our future, it's an epic about hope, our shared humanity, and answering our greatest mystery. It's a game we've dreamt of playing, and it wasn't until now that we have the hardware, the technology, and the team who's hard at work at home to make that dream a reality. We're excited to finally share our first in-game teaser and something to look forward to.
Did Starfield ever really have a chance? Like, actually, did people give it a fair shot? Did you give it a fair shot? A lot of players didn't even touch it before writing it off. Between reviews, the discourse, and the comparisons, plenty of people decided how they felt before they ever even loaded the game up. But some of us did play it. We put real time into it, and we wanted it to work. Some of us really wanted to like it, and plenty of people do like it, and that's fine. But the reality is, the vast majority of players who played Starfield walked away with the same feeling. The game isn't broken like Fallout 76, it's not unplayable, and it didn't really launch in a disaster state. It functions. It's just mediocre. And that stings. And for Bethesda fans, that might be worse than a bad game. A bad Bethesda game gives you something to argue about. People defend it, you can hope it even gets fixed. But a mediocre game that's structurally deficient gives you nothing to come back to. And that's what this video is about. I'm not dunking on Starfield, even though it's hard not to. I'm not just taking shots at Bethesda. I'm a huge fan. I want to talk about why a game with this much time, money, and ambition ended up feeling so flat. Why so many people bounced off it quickly. Once you break it down, you realize Starfield's problems aren't small. This game never could have succeeded. At least the way that they designed it. The core design decisions that shaped the entire experience held it back before it could ever really get going. If you enjoy this content, please like, comment, and subscribe. And now I have a story to tell.
We have also been working on a brand new next generation single player game. But this one is in an all new epic franchise. Our first wholly original franchise in 25 years. We're excited to announce our next adventure.
Starfield was officially announced in 2018. Bethesda described it as their first new IP in over 25 years. A brand new universe, separate from the Elder Scrolls and Fallout. Development had reportedly started years earlier, around 2016, and the game was positioned as a long-term project for the studio. In 2021, Bethesda showed us the first real footage of Starfield during E3, alongside interviews with Todd and other studio leads. During those interviews, Todd Howard described Starfield as Skyrim in space. Bethesda talked about the game as a large-scale RPG focused on exploration, player freedom, and role-playing. They emphasized that it would be a deeper RPG than some of their recent releases, with character backgrounds, factions, and more traditional role-playing systems. Marketing also highlighted its scope. A massive universe, thousands of planets, the ability to travel across star systems. The game was built on Creation Engine 2 and positioned as a major technical step forward for the studio. Visually and thematically, Bethesda described the setting as NASA punk, grounded science fiction inspired by real-world space exploration. Starfield was also framed as a flagship title for the Xbox, following Microsoft's acquisition of Bethesda's parent company. By the time of its release, Starfield had been marketed for several years as a large, ambitious space RPG meant to define Bethesda's future.
It's your soul, save me from the night. Set me there, hope your wings will be eternal.
Starfield released in September of 2023 on PC and Xbox Series consoles. At launch, the game was technically stable compared to some of Bethesda's past releases. There were bugs, but nothing on the scale of Fallout 76 or other high-profile troubled launches. For many players, Starfield ran well enough to play start to finish without major issues. Bethesda offered access to players who purchased premium editions, allowing some of the most invested fans to play several days before the full release. That early access period helped set the initial tone around the game, as first impressions spread quickly through social media, streams, and early reviews. Critical reception at launch was mixed. Reviews generally praised Starfield's ambition, visual presentation, and technical improvements, while also noting pacing issues and a slow opening. Many outlets described the game as a slow burn, suggesting that the experience improved the longer players stayed with it. Early reviews also focused heavily on the game's size and scope. The number of planets, the scale of the universe, and the breadth of systems were frequently highlighted as defining features, even when critiques were raised about how those systems were connected. Player response during the launch window varied. Some players committed dozens of hours early on, engaging with the main story, faction quests, and side content. Others bounced off within the first few hours, citing a lack of momentum or engagement. As more players spent time with the game, discussion began to shift away from performance and bugs and towards the overall experience. Conversation focused less on whether Starfield worked and more on how it felt to play. Within weeks of release, Starfield's launch narrative had largely settled. It was seen as a functional, polished game that delivered on its basic promises, but reactions to its design and pacing remained divided. In the months after release, the conversation around Starfield solidified. Discussion gradually moved away from launch issues and towards long-term engagement. As more time passed, frustration began to set in. Starfield felt like a culmination of problems Bethesda fans had been warning about for years. A common pattern emerged in how people talked about their time with the game. Many players reported putting in 10 to 15 hours before losing interest. They didn't necessarily encounter game-breaking issues, they just stopped feeling compelled to continue. For a lot of players, Starfield did not exist in a vacuum. It followed and was attached to the stigma of Fallout 76. And while Fallout 76 eventually improved, the damage to trust never fully healed. Starfield was supposed to be a reset, the proof that Bethesda still understood what made their game special. Instead, many fans felt like it confirmed their worst fears. By early 2024, Starfield's player counts on Steam had dropped below Bethesda's previous major releases. While the game remained commercially successful, its long-term retention became a frequent point of discussion in the community. Bethesda's newest RPG was being outplayed by games over a decade old. User reviews reflected a shift in tone. What started as mixed reactions turned increasingly negative over time. Criticisms became less charitable, players stopped couching complaints and started questioning Bethesda's design direction outright. The release of Shattered Space only intensified that sentiment. By the early 2025, the expansion had a mostly negative rating, reinforcing the idea that Starfield's issues weren't surface-level problems that could be easily patched away. By 2026, a clear divide had formed. There were players who liked Starfield, but among long-term Bethesda fans, the dominant sentiment had shifted towards outright dislike and, in some cases, anger. For many, Starfield wasn't just a mediocre game. It was their last straw. Years of goodwill built on Morrowind, Oblivion, Skyrim, and Fallout had been spent, and Starfield, rather than rebuilding that trust, became a point where a lot of fans stopped giving Bethesda the benefit of the doubt. And that's where Starfield stands now. The core claim for issue number 1 is that Starfield replaces handcrafted exploration with procedurally generated canvases, and in doing so, removes the sense of discovery that defines Bethesda games. The biggest problem with Starfield starts at the core of what made Bethesda games special in the first place: exploration. Bethesda built its reputation on handcrafted worlds that felt dense and unique. Following quest markers always felt like more of a suggestion. Along the way, you might stumble into a cave or run into a bandit camp, and more often than not, that ended up being what made the playthrough memorable. That's the expectation people brought into Starfield. Players expected authored spaces, environmental storytelling, moments where you stumbled into something unexpected and felt like the game hadn't planned for you to be there. Starfield, however, threw that out of the window. Instead of continuous handcrafted worlds, Starfield is built out of fragments. Small, semi-altered locations, separated by menus, loading screens, and fast travel. Between those locations are vast procedural surfaces that mostly exist as filler. You don't really even explore planets in a game about exploring planets. You're being placed onto patches of terrain, little fish bowls, random, flat, and uninteresting almost every time. The same points of interest repeat across different worlds, the same facilities, the same layouts, the same encounters. Once you recognize the pattern, the illusion collapses. Exploration stops being discovery-driven and feels procedural. And procedural generation isn't necessarily the problem by itself. The problem is that the procedural canvases don't carry narrative intent, and they're the primary foundation of Starfield's world design. They don't tell stories on their own. They don't naturally create moments the way handcrafted spaces do. In older Bethesda games, stories emerge simply because of how the world was built. You could find a skeleton in a cave, a ruined house with clues scattered all around it, a location that told a story. Sometimes it never even gave you a quest. In Starfield, that discovery is rare, if not impossible. And once you realize most planets are just variations of the same handful of templates, exploration isn't fun anymore. It becomes a task. Something you do because the game asks you to, not because you feel pulled towards it. Skyrim's map was almost entirely handcrafted. Fallout rewarded wandering off the main path. Your playthroughs were often better because you ignored fast travel. Starfield doesn't allow that. You have to fast travel, open menus, jump between isolated spaces instead of moving through a cohesive world. Exploration isn't driven by curiosity in Starfield, and I felt that immediately. In my opinion, if exploration doesn't work, a Bethesda RPG doesn't work. And Starfield didn't just stumble here. It removed the very thing that carried its predecessors for hundreds of hours. Outpost building doesn't deepen Starfield's RPG systems or exploration systems. It excuses their absence. It turns what should have been a strong RPG with survival elements into an okay base builder sitting on top of a weak role-playing game. Outposts don't expand exploration in Starfield. Instead, they're actively designed to excuse the lack of exploration. Instead of planets being filled with authored locations, meaningful landmarks, and environmental storytelling, large stretches of space are left empty, and that emptiness is treated as acceptable because the player can build there. If a planet feels barren, the answer isn't that something was missed, the answer is that you're supposed to put something there yourself. That design choice changes how exploration works at a fundamental level. You don't move through the world that's carefully constructed, you move through blank spaces that exist to be filled later, if you should choose to. Outposts also don't meaningfully affect the world around them. You can build one, expand it, abandon it, or ignore it entirely, and nothing changes. The story doesn't respond, and factions don't react. Trade routes don't shift. The setting doesn't acknowledge that you settled anything anywhere. So when you're exploring and you find an empty stretch of land, there's no payoff waiting for you. There's no sense that this place matters. It was just another spot you could build, not somewhere the game gives you a reason to care about. In my opinion, Bethesda actually mastered homesteading in Skyrim's Hearthfire DLC. Skyrim had a dense, handcrafted world. Exploration worked on its own. You could wander anywhere and constantly find things worth seeing. Only after that foundation was in place did Bethesda look for genuinely empty, low-interest areas and place homesteads in those gaps. Building didn't replace the exploration, and it complemented it finally. In Starfield, that process is reversed. The worlds are sparse first, and outposts are used to justify that sparsity. Instead of discovering something meaningful, you're expected to make your own meaning in spaces that were never designed to be interesting in the first place. Outposts should have reinforced the exploration. They should have tied into factions, trade, or survival in ways that made certain locations feel valuable. Finding the right place to build should have felt like a discovery in itself. Instead, most locations feel interchangeable. And you don't feel like you're uncovering a world. You're filling in blanks, and there's lots of blanks to fill in. Even when Starfield does handcrafted content, it rarely creates a place that feels fun, dense, or rewarding to explore. The problem isn't just how few handcrafted areas there are, it's the ones that we get don't really deliver. Take New Atlantis. From a distance, it looks massive. Clean lines, huge structures, a capital city meant to sell the future of humanity. But once you're inside, that scale evaporates. Districts are spread far apart, density is low, and there's very little to discover once you step off the main path. You can walk for a long time and find almost nothing that feels intentional. It's impressive to look at, but very hollow to inhabit. And part of why that emptiness stands out so much is the NPCs. Starfield leans heavily on procedurally generated crowds, and they look off. Faces clash with named characters, animations feel stiff, crowds don't behave like people living their lives, they behave like placeholders meant to suggest activity. Neon is another good example. Conceptually, Neon should have been one of the most interesting places in the game. A corporate-run pleasure city built on vice, exploitation, and excess. Visually, it sells the idea well, but functionally, it's narrow. Neon is basically one main strip with a few side rooms branching off of it. There's very little verticality, very few hidden spaces, and not much reason to wander. You see most of what it has to offer very quickly. It looks alive, but in reality it's very flat. Aquila City, on the other hand, leans heavily into the frontier aesthetic. Mud streets, walls, guards, a rough and tumble presentation that feels familiar if you've played Bethesda games before. But it doesn't have any edge. There's no real sense of danger, no strong identity that sets it apart beyond surface level vibes. To me, it feels like a Fallout town, but not favorably. It feels safe, predictable, and undercooked. Then there's the key. Visually, it's one of the more interesting locations in the game. It has a clear faction identity and a strong atmosphere. The first time you arrive, it actually feels promising. But you'll quickly realize there's not much to do there. Once you finish the relevant quests, it turns into set dressing. You're not uncovering secrets, you're not rewarded for sticking around, and the novelty wears off fast. Paradiso and the Red Mile might be the most frustrating examples. Both are great ideas on paper, hints at a class divide and luxury tourism in space. The Red Mile suggests danger, spectacle, and something closer to a sci-fi gauntlet. Players walk into these places thinking, this looks really cool, and they walk out realizing that was basically it. They're underused, underdeveloped, they feel like concepts that never got the attention or time that they needed. In older Bethesda games, cities and towns were discovery engines. They hid secrets, they invited wandering, and you were rewarded for poking around. In Starfield, locations feel more like backdrops. Interaction is shallow, curiosity rarely leads anywhere meaningful. Even Starfield's handcrafted content doesn't feel mysterious. It just feels unfinished. Starfield's companions are written to be likable, but in trying so hard to please the player, they lose everything that makes a companion feel interesting. Almost every major companion is morally aligned in the same direction. They're supportive, reasonable, and polite. They agree with you far more often than they'll challenge you. And when disagreement does come up, it's usually softened or avoided altogether. There's very little friction. That creates a cast that feels safe, pleasant, inoffensive, and completely forgettable. In moment-to-moment play, companions rarely push back on your decisions. They don't seriously question your motives, they don't force you to sit with the consequences of what you've done. It ends up feeling less like traveling with people and more like traveling with an HR-approved coworker. In Fallout 4, companions worked because they weren't designed to please you. They had strong opinions, clear falls, and moral lines they wouldn't cross. Some of them would dislike you, some of them would argue with you, and some of them would abandon you entirely if you kept pushing. You didn't like the companions because they were nice. You liked them because they felt human. Starfield tries much harder to make you like its companions, and that effort shows. The backstories are delivered clearly, personal arcs are structured to avoid discomfort, and emotional beats are signposted instead of earned. Very few moments force you to make a choice that risks losing someone. So instead of depth, you get manufactured relatability. In RPGs, companions are mirrors. They reflect who you are and what you've chosen to do. When they disagree with you, it gives weight to your decisions. When they leave, it tells you something about the kind of character you're playing. When companions don't push back, your choices lose meaning. The companions in Starfield will have you wonder, why does everyone agree with me? Why doesn't anyone feel risky to travel with? Why don't I hate any of them? But why don't I care about any of them? The problem is that Starfield's companions are written to be liked. And in doing so, they end up not being written to be remembered. Starfield's moment-to-moment gameplay is fragmented. Everything meaningful happens behind a menu or loading screen, and it destroys immersion, momentum, and flow. I will actually go on the record and say Bethesda's use of loading screens in the past hasn't bothered me. But as other studios innovate with new technology, Bethesda feels like they're stuck in the past. And Starfield's moment-to-moment gameplay is fragmented. Anything meaningful you do is separated by a menu or a loading screen. Travel, exploration, interiors, even short distances. You're constantly stopping, selecting, fading out, loading back in, and repeating that process. You don't move between space, you're hopping between instances. Going anywhere follows the same rhythm. Menu, fade, load, menu, land, another menu, load again. Even when you're already close to something, the game rarely lets you just go there. That kills momentum. There's no sense of journey, no build-up, no anticipation. You never feel like you're traveling from one place to another. You just appear where the game decides the next thing should happen. Because of that, you never develop spatial memory. You don't learn the world, you don't internalize distances or routes, you don't feel where anything is in relation to anything else, you just teleport around. Games like No Man's Sky showed us years ago that seamless takeoff, flight, and landing are achievable. It creates continuity, space feels physical, and the scale feels real. Against that backdrop, Starfield feels dated. This game leans heavily on loading screens, environments are segmented, systems are built around pauses instead of flow, everything is designed to stop you, reset you, and move you somewhere else instead of letting one action roll into the next. Starfield doesn't feel like a modern space game. It feels like a 2010 RPG wearing a 2023 coat of paint. And obviously this problem doesn't exist on its own. Exploration is already gutted, handcrafted areas are already shallow, and outposts sit in empty space. The constant loading magnifies it all. When exploration is thin, every interruption stands out more. When locations aren't rewarding, every menu feels like friction instead of a transition. The game never builds momentum because it never lets you stay in motion long enough. And many players have said the same thing. For a game built around space, Starfield rarely lets you feel like you're moving through it. Starfield gives the illusion of choice, but rarely follows through. Most systems operate in isolation, so player decisions don't meaningfully affect anything beyond the immediate moment. You're presented with dialogue options, you're asked to make decisions, and you're told your character background and skills matter. But most of the time, those choices reconverge almost immediately. Major decisions rarely change the world in a meaningful way. Outcomes feel cosmetic, NPCs react in the moment, the quest resolves, and then the game moves on as if nothing happened. That's because most of Starfield's systems exist in isolation. Factions barely acknowledge each other, if at all. Outposts don't affect politics, trade, or power. Ship design almost never changes how quests play out. Skills mostly unlock permissions instead of new approaches. So even when you do make a choice, it doesn't echo outward. Nothing reinforces it, nothing builds on it, and the world feels unchanged by your decisions. And this isn't a new problem for Bethesda. They've been doing this same kind of choice for years. In Skyrim, you chose between the Stormcloaks or the Imperials. In Fallout 4, it was the Railroad, the Institute, or the Brotherhood of Steel. In Starfield, it's Crimson Fleet or SysDef. Bethesda treats choice like a fork in the road. You pick this or you pick that. You want chocolate or do you want vanilla? You pick a side, play a questline, and move on. And the problem is obvious. This isn't the player choice that people are asking for. It isn't about picking between two outcomes. It's about branching. It's about consequences stacking. It's about earlier decisions closing doors and opening others, and reshaping how the game responds to you over time. That's why so many people point to Baldur's Gate 3 when talking about decisions. The game understands what commitment looks like. Choices branch, systems interact, and the game pushes back. You can actually try to break the game. In Starfield, you make one choice, and it affects the rest of the playthrough. Systems also feel like they exist in isolation. Exploration feels pointless because nothing reacts to what you find. Outposts feel hollow because they don't matter. Companions feel flat because they rarely disagree in a way that sticks. The way Bethesda treats choice and system interaction is you act, the game acknowledges it briefly, and then it forgets. And I want to make it clear, the absence of consequence is not player freedom. Okay, and here's my last issue, and it kind of is a culmination of all of the issues before it. And it's that the tone of the game falls flat because the actual game can't support it. Starfield wants you to feel in awe, wonder at space, curiosity about the unknown, and the significance of discovery. But the gameplay beneath it is dull, fragmented, and it causes the tone to never land. How am I at awe when I'm cycling through load screens? I'm not curious because there's nothing there to find. It's all procedurally generated. And there is no significance to my discoveries because, again, they're procedurally generated. Bethesda is aiming for a cosmic wonder, a beautiful exploration game, and the discovery of some kind of spiritual experience. It can't work if exploration isn't rewarding, travel isn't immersive, locations aren't memorable, and discovery lacks payoff. The tone can't exist in a vacuum. They can't just tell me I'm supposed to be in awe at the scene that I'm seeing if I'm not. That's one of the quieter issues about Starfield that a lot of people never highlight. When you look at the tone of Bethesda games, they almost always land. In Skyrim, you feel it. In Fallout, you feel it. And in Starfield, you don't feel it. What you end up feeling instead of curiosity and wonder is indifference, detachment, and fatigue. The tone and story reach for something profound, but the player experience cannot support it. So those are the reasons why I think Starfield failed. The game isn't terrible, but for Bethesda RPG experience, it's fundamentally flawed in design. The exploration doesn't pull you forward, handcrafted spaces don't reward curiosity, outposts just exist to justify the emptiness, companions are uninteresting, choices don't matter, systems don't interact, and the constant stopping and loading kills any sense of momentum. None of these problems exist in isolation. They build up until you burn out. And together, they turned what should have been a defining space RPG into something that feels forgettable. But here's the thing I want you to remember. Starfield didn't fail because the idea was bad. The setting isn't the problem. The tone isn't necessarily the problem, and even a lot of the systems in isolation aren't the problem, because with a different approach to exploration, stronger follow-through on choices, tighter world design, and systems that actually reinforce one another, Starfield could have been something genuinely great. And that is what the next video is going to be about. We're going to rebuild Starfield from the ground up in a realistic way, and show, in my opinion, what would have been the perfect Bethesda sci-fi that would have justified waiting longer for Elder Scrolls 6. If you made it this far, you probably wanted that version of Starfield too. I'll see you in the next one. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Also, check out our game, Winter Reach Emporium, and give it a wish list. Have a great day, everyone.